Hello, Petal. How you doing? How's it going? We're halfway through the month, halfway through the book. This chapter's going to be a bit of a longer one. It's 15 pages, so a little bit more bang for your buck, as it were. That sounds really wrong, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean? I have got an idea for a little side project, especially this time of year, but this year even more so because the world's gone completely flipping bonkers. I don't know about you, but I just can't even look at the news right now. I'm just like, turn it off. I'm very aware of like socio-political, geopolitical, global issues and all that sort of thing. And as such, I just want to turn it off right now. I really do. Some of it we can find comical. A lot of it we can find just absolutely ludicrous. But no matter what, we can't lose sight of the humanity of people, and that's what's given me an idea for a little side project, which I'll let you know a bit more about. But the most important thing is it's not going to detract from the narrating, because that's a little community that's very important to me that we all share together, and I really enjoy it. I do really enjoy it. But it's going to be separate, and obviously because I'm not going to be reading or doing different voices and that sort of thing, and it's going to be a little bit more ad lib, it's a case of it'll just be bite-sized and a bit easier. Not that this is difficult, that sounds wrong. It's a case of it's different. I don't need to concentrate so much, but I do need to focus, if that makes any sense. Anyway, I'm going to stop blethering about that. It's just an idea at the moment, but it'll be another playlist, and it'll be a few lives, I hope, more in the form of a podcast. And I'm just toying with the idea of how I'm going to do it, but it's more a case of more of a supportive thing, like, yeah. It's in that sort of like phase. That's the technical term. Anyway, we're cracking on for time. So, Chapter 9 of Here Comes the Sun by Mr. Thomas Holt. Thank you, said Staff cautiously. That's very, Clerical gave him a slightly distant smile and returned to her desk, leaving him with a rather mixed emotions. On the one hand, it was touching to think that she had remembered his birthday. Narrators know what frickin' here offers birthdays. Oh, here, have cakes. Or you make it. In the last place I went to, you had to make all the cakes and you had to supply all the cakes. It's just that whole sort of thing where everybody crowds around you and sings happy birthday, and it's the most cringy, most orcs thing that you could imagine. But I digress. On the one hand, it was touching to think that she had remembered his birthday. On the other hand, it was profoundly tiresome that she had chosen a present more than usually unidentifiable. If he assumed it was an executive paperweight and left it lying on his desk, it would most probably turn out to be a labour-saving kitchen device, and its continued presence in the office would cause immortal offence. If, however, he took it home and put it in the big box in the cupboard under the stairs, it would undoubtedly turn out to be an executive paperweight, and he'd end up having to make his own coffee every morning for the next 2,000 years. Difficult. Many happy returns, Skip. It was Denzel from the post room, with a palpably bottle-like shape suffused in brown paper. Staff smiled warmly. He didn't drink, but at least he knew what the present was and could guess approximately how much it had cost. It was the sort of present that authors of social interaction in the workplace hotly recommended. He could give it, he decided, to the window cleaner for solstice. Memo to the head of department, general supplies, he said into his dictating machine. Truth with a capital T, underlined. New note, I note with concern that the raw material cost of beauty has risen yet again, this time in excess of 6.42%, whereas the budget allocation for resources in this area has been reduced by 2.8%, full stop. I must therefore ask you to revise the existing beauty-truth ratio as from the 1st of next month, full stop.
I would propose that until further notice, beauty shall be 66.6% truth, with a proportionate adjustment in the inverse ratio for truth/beauty, full stop. New paragraph, row of dots. Narrator's note, ellipses then. I digress. Chief of Staff, etc. Thank you, tape ends. Another narrator's note. Sorry, I'm going to have to stop doing so many narrator's note in the first page, but I digress. Dictating machines. Oh, back in the day, when I used to work at Inland Revenue, when you used to do your letters, you had to do it like this. And the thing is, you'd get a little tape, right, from your dictating machine, and you'd put it in a Polly Pocket. And in the Polly Pocket, you'd have on there the details as well. You'd have like a little green what was it called? It was an A100 or an AS100 form, and you'd literally fill it in of like the main details they had to put on the letter. Oh, I don't know if it's a flashback or if it's just good memories or what, but hey, back in the day. And then you have to put it in the post room and just smell very nicely at people and say, ding dong. He put the tape in the tray for clerical to collect and sighed. Oh, he was posh, he had a tray. Everyone was going to blame him, and it really wasn't his fault. Never mind. It couldn't be helped. Nothing can be helped. Ever. He shuffled about in his in-tray, looking vainly for something he felt he could manage to cope with. Hi. He looked up and saw Ganger in his usual stance, half in, half out of the doorway. Happy birthday, Ganger said. I got you something. Quite fun. He threw a small parcel through the air. Staff caught it and, feeling rather self-conscious, unwrapped it. Thank you, he said, after a long pause for inspection. It's really, Ganger smiled. There's a leaflet inside the box, he said, which explains what it is. He found the little piece of paper and unfolded it. Blank papal bull, it read, for you to excommunicate the person of your choice. There followed 2 columns of instructions in small print. The receipt's in there too, Ganger said. If you don't like it, you can change it. What's the plan? Yes, said Staff, putting the box carefully away in his top desk drawer. I've been thinking about that. Me too, Ganger said. What I've decided, Staff went on, raising his voice slightly, is something a little less risky this time. Something more straightforwardly administrative. I mean, we don't want to put her off by just giving her crises to sort out, do we? All right, Ganger said, sitting on the corner of the desk and picking up the executive present. What had you in mind? Hey, a mate of mine's got one of these. They're really very good if you can get them properly tuned in. Yes, Staff replied firmly. I was thinking of records. Ganger gave him a look. Oh, come on, was all he said. The rest could easily be implied from context. Yes, I know, said Staff, but we don't want to give her the wrong impression, do we? I mean, 70% of what we do is just plain unexciting clerical work, sorting papers, answering queries, filing, ordering, that sort of thing. He stopped. There was something extremely inscrutable about Ganger's usually mobile face. Maybe you're right, though, said Staff quickly. We can put her on that later. How about a tour of duty on earthquakes? Ganger shook his head. No, he said. You're right. Absolutely. No, don't bother to get up. I'll deal with it. I'll let her know straight away. He stood up, pressed a switch on the side of the present that Staff had completely overlooked, and left the office. As he closed the door, a few wafer-thin rose petals formed spontaneously in mid-air and drifted floorwards. When they touched the carpet, they melted like snowflakes. Records, said Staff aloud. Records. A small red light suddenly appeared on the side of the present, then it went out again. Staff spent the next quarter of an hour staring at it, and then covered it up with an office circular. Records, he said a third time. Records? Beats me. It's very simple when you get used to it, said Norman, the supervisor. Once you've been here a few months, you'll find the work is pretty straightforward. Jane nodded.
First impressions, she knew, can be deceptive, but it looked to her as if straightforward was putting it mildly. As far as she could judge, it consisted of picking the envelopes out of the trolley, reading the number stamped on the side, taking the envelope to the appropriate shelf, and leaving it there. She could, she decided, do it in her sleep. In fact, that would probably be the best way she could approach it.
"If you need any help,"
Norman was saying,
"just ask."
"Thanks," said Jane to herself under her breath. "The sort of help I'm going to need here is not the sort you're likely to be able to supply." She smiled and headed for the trolley. On her 17th visit to the shelves, she collided gently with a bespectacled male person who fell against the shelf, dislodging its contents. "Sorry," she said.
"Don't worry about it,"
said the person.
"These things tend to happen in an infinite universe. By the way, you're standing on my foot."
"Oh, sorry."
"No, not at all. Thank you. That's much better. Do please continue with what you were doing while I laboriously put all this lot back."
He scowled at her and stooped wearily down. "Please," said Jane through stiff lips, "let me help you." The person gave her a prickly smile.
"How excessively kind of you," he said. "Gosh, how original of you. For years now I've been putting them in numerical order, but you are quite right. Think what an exciting challenge it'll be for the researchers if they're all jumbled up together like that."
Jane drew in a half lungful of breath and started again, while the person looked at her.
"You're mortal, aren't you?"
he observed. "Yes," Jane replied. She stood on tiptoe to replace 2657668-76375/2308J/3C.
"Do pardon my saying this," the person said, "but wouldn't you perhaps find it rather more conducive, let's say, back on Earth with all the other, people? I understand," he added, "that there's plenty of room for everyone down there. Up here, on the other hand, it's a touch on the, cramped side, if you're not used to looking where you're going."
For a moment, Jane stood with her mouth open. Then it occurred to her that she should have prepared herself for this sort of thing. Since she hadn't, she determined to ignore it. "Not really," she replied, therefore. "In fact, it's pretty much the same up here as down there, I find. Would you be very sweet and put this one back up on the top shelf for me? I can't quite reach." The person glowered at her and then complied.
"It's been a funny old day so far," he observed, groaning as he stretched. "I overslept, arrived here late, found that someone had moved my trolley, forgot my sandwiches, slipped on the polished floor and bruised my knee, and now I've been knocked to the ground and trampled underfoot by a mortal, and it's still only 10:30.
Jane allowed herself a smile. "That's unusual here, isn't it? Sounds like an ordinary day where I come from." The person raised a corner of his mouth. If hyenas had dogs, it was a smile.
"So I had gathered," he replied. "In fact, I understand you people have a special word for it. Life, or something like that."
"Fancy you knowing," Jane replied. "Thank you so much for your help." At 11:15, there was a coffee break. To her disgust, Jane found that departmental coffee tasted very much like the coffee she was used to at home, except that it had even more chicory in it. Her back hurt, and her mind had got pins and needles in it for want of activity. For the first time ever, she began to wonder whether data inputting at Burridge's had been quite as horrible as she'd thought.
"My word,"
said the person, suddenly appearing behind her shoulder as she drained her coffee down to the silt.
"What a lot you've managed to get done."
In spite of herself, Jane felt pleased. She wanted to say, "Of course I have, I'm a mortal after all," or something equally inflammatory, but she very sensibly did not. Instead, she made vague and quiet thanking noises. Beats me how you can do it so fast, the person went on, ordering them, stacking them, and writing the numbers up in the register. Inside Jane's heart, something small, but not entirely trivial, broke. "What register?" she asked. The person smiled, properly this time. "The master file register," he replied. "Didn't they tell you about it? You write down the number of the file and what shelf it's on, and under which section of the shelf, and other things like that. Otherwise, you see, the researchers won't have the faintest idea." "Thank you," said Jane. "I see. Nobody did mention it, actually, but I suppose I should have worked it out for myself." She put her cup down on its saucer. "I suppose I'd better go back and do that, hadn't I?" "That would be a splendid idea," the person agreed. "Oh, by the way, aren't we forgetting something?" Jane stopped still and turned her head slowly. "Are we?" she said. "Sorry, we didn't mean to." 30s lotties for the coffee," said the person sweetly. "We always put the money in that tin on the shelf there. It helps," he added, "to avoid bad feeling and disruptive outbursts of temper." Jane sighed. "That's a nuisance," she said. "You see, I've only got terrestrial money. I don't suppose they accept that here, do they?" The person shook his head. "Not really," he said. "I mean, yes, it's the thought that counts, but it doesn't actually buy a new catering-sized tin when the present one runs out. Let me," he added unpleasantly, "lend you 30 zlotys until you get paid." "Thank you." "Don't mention it." The person, having watched carefully while she put the money in the tin, walked away, leaving her to scream silently in peace and quiet. Then she found Norman and asked him to explain properly about the register. There was a crash. The 4 intruders stopped dead in their tracks, or at least they had tried to. Alcohol, however, tends to enhance momentum. They fell over each other. In the far distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. "Mind where you're putting your bloody feet next time," Darren hissed. "There's guard dogs about. I heard one." "But looks," Jason hissed back. "I haven't heard dogs here for years. Cutbacks, didn't you know?" Darren shrugged and fumbled in his pocket for the key to the hanger, which he'd lifted off the hook 4 hours earlier. He was still worrying about the possibility of dogs, but he wasn't able to let his mates see he was worried. He had his cloud credibility to think about. The lock clicked, and he pushed hard on the door. As it rolled back, a single piercing ray of light speared out into the blackness. Jason hurriedly threw himself against the crack. "You prat," he snarled. "All that bullshit about dogs, and you nearly let the light show. What a wally." The 4 adventurers squeezed through the crack and then drew the door to behind them. Inside the hangar it was, of course, as bright as day, in fact, very considerably brighter. For a moment, they all stood dumbfounded by the sight. Even Darren, who worked in the shed during the day and never had been this close to the thing before. It was enough to fry your brains. Dave was the first to break the silence, and he did it with a nervous giggle. "Oh, come off it," he said. "We're never going to be able to fly this thing." It was intended merely as an observation, but somehow it got badly mutated on its way out past the gate of Dave's teeth, and by the time it reached Jason's ears, it was a challenge with a strong superficial likeness to a taunt. "You reckon?" Jason said. "Watch this then." "I didn't mean," Dave started to say, but his friend was already halfway up the ladder towards the cockpit. There was nothing for it but to follow. "I'm beginning not to like this," observed a voice from the foot of the ladder. "Why don't we just forget about it and do something else? We could go and smash up a few phone boxes or something instead." "You've lost your bottle," Jason sneered. "You haven't got the nuts, have you?" "No," replied Adrian, with a remarkable note of sobriety in his voice. Not for this I haven't, anyway. Dave and Darren paused on the ladder because this was somewhat disturbing. It was commonplace in their social circle that Adrian played the complete head case, afraid of nothing. His favourite way of letting off steam, it was widely rumoured, was spray painting graffiti on the sides of moving asteroids. If Adrian didn't fancy it, the chances were that there was an element of risk. "Stuff you then." Jason's voice drifted down from the top of the ladder, but it sounded far away and hollow. He had clearly found out how to get into the cockpit. Those morons left it unlocked. What a load of pillocks, huh? Nobody gives it to us, Dave agreed, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Maybe this was not such a good idea after all. It really was very big. Very big indeed. Gotcha. There was triumph in Jason's voice, and the other three exchanged glances. You coming, Aid, or not? Adrian paused for a moment. Then he shrugged and shinned quickly up the ladder. He wasn't afraid any more. It had gone past that stage, and he was very curious to find out what was going to happen. Coming, he said. Only if you're not going to bottle out, Jason shouted back. 'Cause if you suddenly get scared, I'm not stopping, right? Get stuffed, Adrian replied, and from his tone of voice the others could tell that he was himself again. The very same Adrian who thought nothing of playing chicken on the edge of time. We'll see who shits himself first, my son. Jason grinned. He was sitting in the pilot's seat, trying to guess which controls did which. He hadn't, he realised, the faintest idea. Here, he said. How'd you make this thing go? Adrian shrugged. I don't know, he said, and leaned forward. Let's try this. He sprawled his hand out into a pink fan and pressed as many buttons as he could. Don't do that, you loser! Dave started to scream. Then his mouth went dry and his tongue became inextricably welded to his palate. The hangar had suddenly become filled with the most agonising light, and all around them they could feel the pulsing of a planet-sized engine. Switch it off for fuck's sake, Dave yelled, but nobody moved. They were all paralysed with terror, and besides it was painfully apparent that it was too late now. The thing was beginning to move. Slowly at first, then, as it built up momentum, slipping down the ramp very fast, then faster and faster still, as if in a dream, Dave noticed that the hangar doors were firmly shut, but the chances were, he felt, that he wasn't going to make much difference. In fact, it was extremely doubtful whether anything was ever going to make any difference ever again. The four joyriders had just enough self-possession left to hurl themselves to the floor of the cockpit as the giant machine ploughed through the diamond and titanium doors of the hangar like a bullet through a bubble, left the ramp, hung for an everlasting fraction of a second in midair, and then began to drop like a very large stone. Then the engines fired. It is at such moments that essential character, distilled and compressed, is most easily observed. Dave and Darren both howled and tried to squash themselves into the same small space under the computer console. Jason sat flattened against the back of the pilot's chair, his face apparently splattered across the front of his head in an expression of sheer horror that would be worth millions to an ambitious film producer. Adrian grabbed wildly for the joystick and pulled. The sun checked itself, seemed to hesitate, and then lifted. The sun rose.
Where is it now?
Staff demanded. There was a silence at the other end of the wire.
Well,
said the voice, and Staff could feel the effort of self-control running up through the wire.
You know the sort of lacy constellation just under the armpit of Sagittarius, like an ammonite with woodworm? I always think, it's out there.
A pause.
Somewhere.
Staff let the hand with the thorn in it wilt. Disasters he could cope with. Anyone whose days are spent in any form of high-level administration gets withdrawal symptoms without at least one disaster before breakfast. But there are limits. His lips went through the motions of repeating the word somewhere, but his larynx wanted no part of it.
You still there, Chief?
Said the voice. He put the phone back by his ear.
Yes, he said. Look, I know this is a damn silly question, but I owe it to myself to ask, is there any chance whatsoever of getting it back?
None, Chief. Sorry.
Storf wilted and winced like a salted slug.
Right. Fine. Thanks for letting me know.
The line crackled a bit.
So, what do we do now, Chief?
Said the voice, nervously. Staff sighed.
Heaven only knows,
he said, and put the phone down. He was, of course, lying. Jason was worried. He had good reason to be. He was a long way from home. His companions had blacked out. For good, by the looks of it. The fuel gauge was deep into the red bit on the far left-hand side of the dial, and there was a funny rattling noise coming from under the bonnet. The only good thing about running out of fuel, as far as he could see, was that when it happened, then the bloody thing would slow down and perhaps even stop. He had been trying to make it do that for some time. The monotony of the view from the cockpit window did not improve matters. It had been as black as 2 feet up a chimney for the last 40 million light years, and that sort of thing can get to you once the effect of the beer start to wear off. And to put the tin lid on it, he found that he'd run out of cigarettes. And then he saw the light. Just a tiny little pinprick far away in the distance, but definitely light. For a few seconds he was elated until he remembered that A, light didn't necessarily connote safety or help, and B, even if it did, he couldn't steer the damn thing towards it anyway. He needn't have been concerned. The engine chose that moment to drain the last drop of fuel in the backup reserve emergency tank, and the sun decelerated and started to drift. A few minutes later, the gravitational field of whatever the bright thing over there was started to have effect, and the whole contraption slowly turned and started to travel towards the light. Jammy. The light was the store. The store had a planet. You could see it from light years away. It was big and bright and blue with the most incredible oceans Jason had ever seen. It was, he realised with a leap of the heart, inhabited, and he was headed straight for it at a nice, slow drift. He'd have called it destiny if it wasn't for the fact that he'd worked there for 6 months and knew how it really worked, so he called it bloody good luck instead. Now soon, much sooner than he had imagined, he was close enough to see the 2 wide belts of golden asteroids that encircled the planet, and a few minuscule sparkles of flashing metal, which could only be space stations. He was nearly there. Help, he screamed. It was, he knew in his heart, a bit early to expect anyone to hear, but there was no harm in just warming up, so to speak. He also stood up in his seat and waved both of his arms. And then, it was one of those moments when the soul dies, when all the light goes out, and all that remains is the horrible feeling of having got it really, really wrong. He shaded his eyes with his hand, hoping against all the probabilities that he was mistaken, but he wasn't. There weren't space stations. They were parking meters, and he had no change of any sort whatsoever. Likewise, the things he'd taken for a 2-fold belt of golden asteroids were something rather more prosaic, but utterly unambiguous. They were double yellow lines. To ram the point home to the point of complete and utter superfluity, the planetary authorities had picked out the words, "No parking," in glowing red dwarfs right across the azimuth. Fuck, he said. If it had been a smaller planet, of course, it would have had to orbit him rather than the other way around. As it was, there was nothing he could do except scream a lot and wave his fists about, and after a while, once the lack of food and the helium-rich atmosphere began to tell on him, he couldn't even do that. When he had been there for a very long time, so long that he could no longer quantify the time with any degree of accuracy whatsoever, he became aware of strange, immaterial figures wandering about the cockpit. They spoke in strange, distorted voices and had a disturbing tendency to walk right through him and out through the cockpit into the blackness outside. They ignored him completely, being apparently entirely engrossed in inexplicable conversations of their own, which he was quite incapable of following beyond a few tantalising phrases. There is no reason to believe that he isn't there to this day. Certainly the inhabitants of the planet would have had no reason to disturb him, given that his timely arrival saved them the expense and trouble of launching a purpose-built satellite to bounce their afternoon soap operas off. The fact that, by some strange quirk of optical distortion, Jason occasionally features in some of the episodes probably adds to their overall enjoyment.
Now then,
Staff said,
let's just pause there a moment, shall we, and recap for a minute. We have the following suggestions.
It was an hour and 7 minutes later, and the pale taut faces around the boardroom table were uniformly blank. Nobody was in any hurry to say anything.
First, Staff continued, we have the proposal that we get the moon back down, spray it all over with luminous paint, bang it up there at sunrise, and hope nobody notices. Now, it strikes me that there are a number of potential difficulties with that idea.
He proceeded to enumerate them, and when he had finished, nobody spoke, and he took the silence as his cue to move on to the next suggestion.
Next, we've got the proposal that we shove a big illuminated sign up in the sky saying normal service will be resumed as soon as possible.
He breathed in and then out again, with the air of someone making the most of it while he still could.
Now, I've got nothing against that. Nothing at all as far as it goes, but in the longer term,
there was no need to go on. The heads nodded ways and means. Staff noticed with a flicker of amusement was already fast asleep, which, given the circumstances, must be a Pavlovian reaction to being in committee.
As for the idea,
he went on,
that we run out an extension cable from the heart of the great cloud of unknowing and try and rig up a set of floodlights as a temporary measure, I've got to admit that as far as I'm concerned, it's the best one we've come across yet, but I still think we've got some way to go before we're actually there. I mean, logistically.
There was a cough from the side of the table, and everyone looked around at a small but extremely, normal-looking figure standing there holding a large tray. "Excuse me," said Jane. "You ordered coffee." She had been working late, trying to sort out the mess she'd made earlier on in the day, and when the committee came stumbling in the boardroom, she'd been told, as the only female life form in sight, to get coffee for 12. Being female, she'd managed the task. Staff smiled bleakly.
"Thanks,"
he said.
"Just put it down there. We'll help ourselves. Now then."
"Excuse me," said Jean again. Everyone looked at her. "Sorry to butt in," she went on, "but I couldn't help overhearing, and I was just wondering if you had considered finance and general purpose sat upright, looking like a stick of anthropomorphic dynamite, but Staff caught his eye and he subsided."
"Well,"
he said. "Only," Jane said, in a small but clear voice, which reminded Staff of something vaguely familiar, something he seemed to remember from a very, very long time ago. What was it? Ah, yes, he suddenly remembered. It was the sound of somebody being sensible. "Maybe you're approaching this from the wrong direction, if you see what I mean. I know it's really nothing to do with me," she went on, "but perhaps there were signs of unrest from around the table. Either this person, this mortal was going to offend their ears with a stream of idiotic and untimely nonsense, which would be bad enough, or else she was going to make an intelligent suggestion. For her part, Jane was aware of a squashed feeling, as if she was an overboiled potato under a steamroller, as was her habit when she felt nervous. She smiled. "It just occurred to me," she said, "and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if you're trying to find some way of bodging up some sort of substitute thing so that nobody will notice, I don't really think you're going to have much luck. No," she said, shaking her head, "what I reckon you need is a diversion. You know, something to take people's attention off the sun so that they wouldn't notice even if there were nothing there at all." There was quiet in the boardroom, compared to which the inside of the average tomb would sound like Rome in the rush hour. Just as the silence was about to solidify and start dripping down the walls, finance and general purposes shook off his air of stunned torpor, fitted a less than pleasant expression to his face, and cleared his throat. "Very good," he said. "And what would you suggest?" "Well," Jane said, in the grey desolation of the small hours of the interstellar morning, the big abandoned lot out round the back of the great cloud of unknowing hummed to the roar of an infinity of different kinds of power tools, variations on the scream of metal cutting into metal, instructions and swear words. The activity was indescribable. Usually movement is perceptible because it's seen against a background of rest, but here there was no background. Everyone, the whole supernatural host, everyone was on overtime. There were two main groups. The smaller group, comprising about a sixth of the whole, was cutting an enormous disc out of a galaxy-sized sheet of the first quality 16-gauge celestium carbonate, while an army of gantries stood by to install 1,000,000 miles of electric flex and 12 billion light bulbs. A subsection of the group was fitting a huge black velvet bag over the moon and rigging it up with a tow hook. In the distance, a fleet of astral freighters were bringing home a hastily gathered harvest of small and relatively unimportant stars, which were going to be used for fuel to run the generators. The other group was 5 times larger and infinitely busier. They were loading the boots of the 10 to the power of 23 cars with 10 to the power of 74 cardboard boxes. Staff, watching the proceedings from a point of vantage on the roof of the Fiat office, glanced down at his watch and bit his lip. 3 hours to go. Either this was going to work, or else he was going to look the biggest prawn in the entire universe of time and space.
"All right,"
he muttered into his walkie-talkie.
"Tell Phase 1 to move out."
The empty vacuum of the back lot was suddenly stiff with the tortured vibration of sound waves as the buzzsaws jawed through the last few miles of celestium carbonate. The disc leaned horribly and fell free onto the supporting cat's cradle of titanium cable. There was a dazzling flash of welding gear as the electrician set to. The engines of the moon began to hum as her crew warmed her up for her unscheduled flight.
"Phase 1,
said the walkie-talkie,
ready and rolling."
on a signal from the control tower. All the 10 to the power of 23 cars started their engines at once. Trying to encapsulate the effect of so much noise in mere adjectives would be like trying to squidge the sea down into an egg cup. Suffice to say, it was loud. The column began to roll.
"This had better work,"
Staff growled as the structure of the cosmos braced itself to withstand the vibration of so many humming engines.
"because otherwise—"
"Oh, I expect it'll be all right," Jane replied, pouring boiling water from her thermos onto a tea bag. "I mean, everyone was always saying how the old one was clapped out and on its last rays anyway, and wouldn't it be a simply splendid idea to get a new one, except it would cost too much and take too long to build. I expect the idea was to save up ESO tokens for the next 60,000 years and finance the refitting program that way." She sighed. It really only goes to prove that you can get things done around here just so long as it's an absolute emergency and they think you're doing whatever it is you're doing for a totally different reason. Funny, don't you think, the lengths that you have to go to? The new model sun, its lights blazing, was lowered from its scaffolding onto an enormous trailer while the two-rope was lowered into position and made fast to the back bumper of the moon. Painfully slowly, complaining every single step of the way at the unaccustomed weight, the moon began to taxi down the strip. "Here goes," said Jane, fingers crossed. The details of the great diversion are so well known and form the basis of so many religions that it would be superfluous to recount them here. All that needs to be mentioned for our purposes is that when humanity awoke in the dim light of a weak, flickering 60-watt dawn, it did not notice anything funny about the lighting. Everybody's attention was riveted to the towering letters of fire pinned to the back of a rainbow that arched across the firmament and announced, "Biggest ever car boot sale now on." To all mortals, creatures of a day, buys on impulse across the face of the globe, no sooner had their brains digested the message than the encircling horizon glared yellow in the indeterminate grey light with the glow of innumerable courtesy lights as 10 to the power of 23 car boots opened as one car boot, and mankind, lifting its eyes heavenwards, saw that it was true. As one leading theologian is reported to have remarked, as a way of proclaiming a new covenant, it beat rainbows into a cocked hat. Those who comment on such things in the calm seclusion of history point out that, as diversionary tactics go, the Great Diversion was a pretty neat piece of thinking. Not only was mankind's attention distracted long enough for the workshops of heaven to cast, found, finish and launch a brand new all-alloy sun with Teflon bumpers and an ABS braking system. The proceeds of the sale were enough to pay for the thing, with enough left over to repaint the outside of the hangar and fit a proper padlock on the door, and the warehouses of general supply were purged of 20,000 years' worth of accumulated junk, which in turn provided Norman and his staff in records with all the storage space they needed to put in place a new and vastly more efficient data storage and retrieval system. In fact, some commentators say, bearing in mind the circumstances of the event and the person whose idea the whole thing was, there's a good case for saying that it was in fact the underlying point of the whole exercise. "Well?" Bjorn repeated. Old Gustavus looked sheepish and evaded his eye. He muttered something about a once-in-a-lifetime bargain. Bjorn grinned. "Yeah," he said, "only you don't know what it is. And it doesn't work. And bits keep coming off in your hand every time you pick it up." "It was a bargain," Gustav retorted, stung. $24.99, and I beat him down from 35. "I know what it is." "And it was the last one he had left," Gustav continued. "In fact, he said he was saving it for someone." "But, you do?" "Yes," Bjorn replied, and yawned. "You've been done," he added. Gustav scowled. Then he noticed a mark on the back of the casing, took out his handkerchief, spat neatly on a corner and rubbed the spot until it was clean again. "Nonsense," he said. "It was reduced. Slight exterior damage, he's told me. Doesn't affect the working in the least." "Right," Bjorn said, and bit the top off another bottle. "And I can see how. You being a woodcutter, it's really essential for you to have a temporal distortion refractor that you know is going to work. Yeah," he added, with a positive nod of his head. "I guess you're right at that." Gustav blinked. "I'm sorry," he said. "Temporal distortion refractor," Bjorn repeated carelessly. "Used to use them a lot when I was on the time gangs.
They're really good for flattening out time.
Whoops. Of course, he added as an afterthought, that's not a whole one. It's just the mainframe stabilizer unit. Still, if you can get it to work, maybe the next car boot sale you go to, you'll find the rest of the gear. You know, the rocker box, the induction manifold, all that stuff. And then you'll be in business. And you'll need the batteries too, of course. He grinned again and drank some beer while his neighbour sat and stared at his purchase for a while. In the distance could be heard the soothing coo of a wood pigeon, sleepy in the warmth of a late summer evening.
I think, said Gustav firmly, I'll put a tablecloth over it and stand it in the corner by the look basket. It'll look nice there, and I could use it to display my bowls trophies.
Yeah, Bjorn said,
or it would make a great footstool.
He parked his boots on it, folded his arms behind his head and lay back.
Did you go to the sale, neighbour?
Gustav inquired. Bjorn shook his head.
Listen, he said, any old departmental stuff I wanted, I nicked before I packed the job in. It's all a load of crap anyway, most of it, all clapped out, and it was junk when it was new, as often as not. Buy it cheap and flog it to death. That's their motto. You take leap year, for instance.
Gustav raised an eyebrow.
Leap year, he said. Yeah,
Bjorn replied.
Leap year. Bloody typical, that is. I mean,
he went on, warming to his theme.
Suppose you were building a seasons plant. You wouldn't cut corners and go around buying in second-hand tat from the breakers' yards, would you? No way. Stands to reason. You buy the real thing and then it's not going to break down, and you don't have to go fixing it every 5 minutes when it gets out of sync. That's not the way they see it, of course. Oh no. And that's why we've got leap year. You didn't think it was like deliberate, did you?
Bjorn sniggered unkindly.
No way, he said. Main bearing's completely shot. So a bloke I used to know on maintenance told me once. Miracle the whole thing doesn't pack up on them. Serve them right if it did.
He fell silent and lay on his back, scowling at his toes. A family of chipmunks scampered up and down the branch above his head, chirruping wildly. A dragonfly droned past, the sun flashing on its kaleidoscope wings.
What a beautiful day, Gustav remarked involuntarily. Really, neighbour Bjorn, it does my old heart good to see it. Can't you just...
He paused. He knew he was wasting his breath, but he couldn't help it. The infinite wonders of nature never failed to move him, even at his age.
Can't you just feel the thirsty earth drinking in the life-giving warmth and the seeds bursting into life under their soil? Can't you just... Yeah.
Bjorn was looking puzzled.
Yeah,
he repeated.
You've got a point there.
He frowned, sat up absent-mindedly, swatted the dragonfly with the back of his hand, and stared thoughtfully at the sun for a very long time.
"'Tis funny that," he said.
Oh, where did the sun end up? Will the diversion remain? How many bargains were found at the car boot sales? Do you know, when I was very young, I remember when we first came back to the UK and we used to go to the Gill's Cafe or Jill's Cafe car boot sale, and it was a truck stop in Hampshire. And I remember I got this electronic game back when games were awesome. Well, not actually, no, gaming's awesome now, but I mean the handheld games, and it was a Space Invaders handheld game, and I thought I had the highest technology ever invented. But you look at it now and think, I could have that on my phone. And you'd think, that's a bit of a tack game, that. But back then, I thought it was the most amazing thing I'd ever had. It was 50p, man. 50p. And it was just like, I thought that was an absolute fortune, you know. And we're talking, we're going back to 1986. And for me, 50p was an absolute fortune, and I couldn't believe that I'd got this game. And I adored that game so much. But then I had to ask for batteries when they ran out. Yeah. Batteries, on the other hand, were an expensive commodity that wasn't so freely available to my young mind, so it ended up just put on the shelf with the books. But that was my game. Oh, I wonder what happened to it. Hey, that was a good memory, that. So, we are still forging ahead for the Christmas Day live read for the day, which will be awesome. As I said, I'm going to probably do it over like a few shifts, so it gives me a chance to have a break in between, and have to dash off and use the ladies' room and powder my nose. You know how it goes. Make a cup of tea. I'll have to have a couple of flasks of tea on the side. Do you know, when I used to have really, really long baths and stuff, I used to always have like 2 flasks of tea and a cup of tea, because I used to like have my baths for at least 2.5, 3 hours before I got bad asthma. So that'd be a nightmare. But I digress. Happy days. Happy days, so much fun. But that's how much I love my tea. Don't drink as much now, of course, but So, yes, Christmas Day, we are going full ahead for it. I'll let you know more about my little side project as I get the plans in place, and hopefully you'll be into that sort of thing. It's going to be more of a chatty thing and a kind of like comparing of ideas and, just different experiences and stuff. And by all means, if you want to join in, you're more than welcome as always. And you'll be very, very welcome, because I adore your souls. Definitely. Now, the next chapter is going to be a little one. So that should be done, hopefully, in a couple of days, cross fingers. But the one after that is absolutely immense. So I might take a bit of a run up for that one. But the most important thing is, this time of year, please, please take care of yourselves. Always, if you want to, drop a line, send an email. If you want to leave a comment, leave a comment. If you want to send an email, send an email. No matter what, we are always here for each other, and I adore our little community, and I do very, very much appreciate you for everything you do and all of the support and all of the comments. They do mean the absolute world. You are appreciated, you are important, and you are special, and that's not any BS or hyperbole. Is it hyperbole? You know what I mean. I suppose it's in the wrong context, but I'm really tired and I haven't slept. I just thought I'd do this recording to make sure I got one done. Yeah. And if you can hear that, that's awesome. So, as ever, please hit the notifications bell so you don't miss episodes, because I'll keep doing them as live premieres. If you can put a like if you enjoyed the episode, share, subscribe if you want to, but no digs in having to. And most of all, hydrate if you're too hot, keep warm if you're too cold. Stay safe. Talk to you soon, Pat.